By the time I pulled off 6th Avenue and turned toward the quiet grid of North Tacoma, my body felt like a shell. 16 hours of tying rebar and moving steel on the Point Ruston site had hollowed me out. My shoulders still ached from the rain-soaked beams. My hands throbbed from rope burns, and the grit of cement dust clung to my skin no matter how many times I rubbed my palms together on the steering wheel. All I wanted was the same thing I'd wanted every night since I was a girl in this house, a shower hot enough to sting, food that didn't come from a drive-through bag, and the chance to close my eyes without anyone asking for more. The streets glistened with the drizzle that never quite leaves this city, and I parked in front of the craftsman house I'd painted once with my father. Graham, back when he was still home more often than not. The maple tree out front bent in the damp breeze, just as it always had. I climbed the porch steps, shoulders sagging under my duffel, and slid my key into the lock. It stopped cold. I jiggled it, tried again, felt the old brass resist me like I was a stranger. For a moment, I thought I had lost my grip from fatigue. But then the door opened, and there she was. Diane stood framed in the porch light, hair knotted up like she'd spent the day at yoga, leggings spotless, phone still glowing in her hand. Her smile was the kind that meant she'd been waiting for this exact second. Behind her, Kellen, her son, never mine, was stretched across the couch, my old Pacific Lutheran hoodie on his back, his laugh bouncing off the walls like he had inherited them too. "You're back early," Diane said, like the locks hadn't just refused me. "The key doesn't work," I told her, my voice rough from dust. "We changed them," she replied, voice calm and sharp as glass. "For safety." Her tone made clear whose safety she meant, and the sight of Kellen reaching into a bag of chips I'd bought told me everything else. My fingers curled tighter around the useless key. I stepped back onto the porch, the air colder than before, already sensing the weight of the fight I hadn't yet named. And when she leaned against the frame with that smile, I knew this night was only the beginning of a longer demand waiting on the other side of her words. Diane didn't waste time dressing the moment in pleasantries. She crossed her arms and said the locks were changed because I had fallen behind. She pulled a folded sheet of paper from the counter, like she had rehearsed the performance. "Back rent, utilities, household contributions," she recited, tapping the columns she had drawn in neat handwriting. $50,000. Pay up and you can stay under this roof. Behind her. Kellen let out a low whistle and tossed his phone onto the couch. "That's just one decent union paycheck, isn't it? You'll be fine." He grinned like he'd scored a point, then dragged my hoodie tighter around his shoulders, as if ownership came just from wearing what was mine. I felt the weight of the duffel digging into my arm, but didn't set it down. My eyes moved past Diane's smug expression, cataloging details the way I did on the job site when a beam didn't sit flush. Fresh screws gleamed on the strike plate, bright silver against weathered brass. On the hall table, a locksmith's card sat half-covered by a scented candle. The evidence of their coordination was all in plain sight, waiting for me to notice. "Did Dad approve this?" I asked finally. My voice stayed steady, though the words were jagged in my throat. Diane's smirk didn't falter. "He's consulting overseas. While he's gone, this is my house, my rules." Her certainty hit harder than her numbers. For her, the demand wasn't about bills or fairness. It was about power, about rewriting who held the right to stand in the doorway. I let the silence stretch between us, my hand loosening on the useless key. No shouting, no bargaining. I stepped back, the porch boards creaking under my boots. Diane raised her chin as if she'd won, but I was already calculating what her performance had exposed. Without another word, I turned and walked down the steps, the night air cutting colder as I headed back toward the truck, and the memory that waited in the red file I had never dared to open until now. The porch light faded behind me as I walked back to the truck, but the weight in my chest carried me farther back than the street ahead. Memories clung to that house like smoke in the walls. each one sharper now that I'd been locked out. After my mother's funeral, Dad remarried quicker than I understood. Diane came through the doorway with boxes that smelled like department stores, setting them down on top of the cinnamon candles my mom had always lit on winter nights. Within weeks, the photographs of my mother were taken down, replaced with glossy prints of bridges and skylines that meant nothing to anyone who lived there. The scent of cinnamon disappeared, replaced with lavender sprays and a refrigerator shelf stocked with Kellen's energy drinks. Dad thought he was giving me stability when he left for contracts overseas, but the house never stayed steady. Every time a faucet dripped or the furnace rattled, it was me crawling under sinks or tightening bolts. I learned to carry that house on my shoulders the way I carried rebar, silently, hoping someone would notice. No one ever did. On my 21st birthday, Dad had flown back briefly between jobs. He took me to a notary's office in the Stadium District, the kind of place that smelled like old paper and ink. He handed me documents without much explanation, only saying it was for security. I signed where he pointed, half aware, wondering why my birthday gift came with so much formality. When I asked what it meant, he told me to keep the file safe, maybe forever unused. Think of it as a map, he said, one you may never have to unfold. I had tucked that red file away in the lockbox in my truck, unopened, trusting his word. Now, standing in the cold street after Diane's demand, I knew exactly where that map was waiting. I refused to stand on the porch like a beggar waiting for permission to cross a threshold that had once been mine. The truck engine carried me away from the house, down the wet curve of Ruston Way, where the smell of salt water mixed with diesel. At the construction site, the skeletal frame of steel beams loomed against the night sky, tarps snapping in the wind like restless sails. I pulled my duffel from the cab, spread it on a plywood platform beneath the scaffolding, and wrapped a neon safety vest across my chest for warmth. It wasn't comfort, but it was mine, and no one could change the locks on concrete still waiting to set. The night pressed heavy. I lay flat, listening to the rain patter through gaps in the tarp, watching the cranes sway above me like shadows of giants. Every ache in my body reminded me of the day, but it was the silence that hollowed deeper. I thought of the house not as it stood now, but as it used to be cinnamon candles in the kitchen, my mother's hugs long enough to mend everything broken. Those ghosts filled the cold air around me, and for once, I didn't push them away. Before dawn, I sat up, breath visible in the sharp air, and reached into the lockbox fixed behind my seat in the truck. The red file rested where it had for years, edges worn from being moved but never opened. My hands hesitated, then pulled it out. Inside lay 3 pieces of recorded deed naming me sole owner of the property on North 26th, dated on my 21st birthday, a limited power of attorney tied to emergencies, and an unsigned letter in my father's handwriting. The paper trembled in my grip as I read it. If you ever feel the air get tight at home, this is why. The words settled over me heavier than the scaffolding above. I had been carrying proof without knowing it, a weapon wrapped in silence. For years, I thought loyalty meant waiting, fixing leaks, paying bills, enduring Diane's rules. Now the truth sat in my lap, sharp as any tool I'd ever swung, and I knew it was time to decide how to use it as the first light of morning touched the beams overhead. By the time the courthouse clock struck 8, I was already walking up Pacific Avenue, the red file pressed against my ribs like armor. I hadn't slept much after opening it, the weight of the deed and my father's note thrumming in my mind. But exhaustion felt easier to bear than the memory of Diane's smirk. I stopped in front of a narrow brick building where the plaque on the glass read, Eamon Brackett, Attorney at Law. Inside, the office smelled faintly of old wood polish and brewed coffee. Eamon himself looked nothing like the sharp-edged lawyers from television. His hair was thinning, his tie slightly off-center, but his eyes carried the kind of patience that comes from years of watching people arrive on the worst day of their lives. I sat across from him and opened the red file, I told him everything, how Diane had changed the locks, how she had demanded $50,000 in back rent, how Kellen laughed while wearing what wasn't his. My voice wavered only once, when I described turning the key and feeling it stop dead in the lock. Eamon didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, glanced at the papers, and made a few notes in neat block letters. When I finished, he tapped the deed. "This is clean," he said. "Recorded, valid, and unambiguous, which means we don't argue with them. We let the law do the talking. Washington law requires you to serve a 20-day notice to terminate a month-to-month tenancy. If they refuse, you file an unlawful detainer case here in Pierce County Superior Court. The court issues a writ of restitution. The sheriff enforces it." I frowned. "So I can't just—" "No," he cut in gently. "You don't change locks back. You don't throw their things out. That's self-help eviction. Illegal. Even if you're the owner, you wait. You document. Every call, every text, every demand. You let the court see who's reasonable and who isn't." His calmness steadied me more than I expected. Fury still burned in my chest, but he gave it direction. We arranged for a professional process server to deliver the notice. Eamon handed me a checklist for an evidence binder: photographs, bills, proof of payment, copies of every message. When I left the office, the drizzle along Pacific felt less like weight and more like clarity. I had a path forward, not fast, but certain, and I was ready to take the first step that would lead me straight back to Diane's door. That night, I sat in the cab of my truck with a yellow pad balanced on my knee, the deed open beside me. Anger tempted me to write in all caps, to throw Diane's words back at her. But Eamon's voice stayed with me. Keep it measured, keep it professional. So I wrote, "No rent is owed. I am the recorded owner. Enclosed is the 20-day notice to terminate occupancy. Any further communication regarding this matter should be directed to counsel." I typed it clean, printed 2 copies, and sealed one in a thick white envelope marked clearly with Diane's name. The other I sent by certified mail. A twin she couldn't claim to have missed. At dawn, the process server I'd hired drove off with the envelope, leaving me with nothing but waiting. I parked 2 blocks down from the house, hands tight on the steering wheel, watching the porch through a thin gap between cedar hedges. At 9 sharp, Diane stepped out in her slippers, phone already in her hand, a mug of coffee steaming against the morning chill. She bent, picked up the envelope, and tore it open without hesitation. The scream that followed rattled through the street like a siren. Curtains lifted in the neighboring houses. Dogs barked. Even a car braked mid-block. Kellen stumbled into the doorway, hair matted, hoodie sliding off one shoulder. He grabbed the papers, eyes scanning as his mouth moved. A curse burst out, then another. Moments later, his face appeared online, shaky video already climbing through feeds. "She's heartless," he spat into the camera. "Throwing out family for nothing. My stepsister's a monster." The comments poured in faster than I could scroll, strangers cursing my name. Distant cousins demanding explanations. Old acquaintances pretending they'd always known I was cruel. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I screenshotted every post, saved every voicemail, noted every name. Proof wasn't measured in likes or outrage. It was stacked in binders for a judge to read. By the time the video spun out of control, I had closed the laptop and opened the binder, sliding the first screenshot into its sleeve, preparing for the weeks that stretched ahead. The 20-day clock began with silence, but Diane was never one to leave a stage empty for long. On the 5th morning, 2 Tacoma police officers knocked on the window of my truck while I was parked outside the site. Diane had called in a trespass, claiming I was harassing her. I showed them the deed and the notice. They exchanged a look that told me they'd seen this kind of family theater before, then left with a clipped, "It's a civil matter." I logged the time, date, and badge numbers in the binder. A week later, Diane threatened a restraining order, her text dripping with official-sounding language, though nothing ever materialized. By then, she was also telling relatives that my father had promised the house in spirit to her and Kellen. as if intentions could rewrite recorded deeds. Each call from a cousin or aunt went straight to voicemail, saved and transcribed before I filed it away. I met with Eamon twice more, his calm steadiness a counterweight to the chaos Diane kept manufacturing. He told me to keep photographing the property, especially the rooms she'd claimed as hers, and to log every utility I had covered in the past year. I printed receipts, marked dates, and stacked them neatly. Evidence grew in the binder like scaffolding around an unfinished tower. Mrs. Sato, the retired schoolteacher across the street, stopped me one afternoon. In her gentle way, she confirmed she'd seen a locksmith's van parked outside the day before the locks changed. She offered to testify if it came to that. I thanked her and added her name to the growing list of witnesses. As the deadline drew close, the tone of the messages shifted. Anonymous texts urged me to show mercy, to remember family. But mercy, as they defined it, meant surrendering the very roof over my head. I copied each message into the binder and turned the page, knowing the countdown was leading me straight toward the courthouse. The deadline came and went, and Diane stayed put. Eamon filed the unlawful detainer the next morning, and within days we were standing beneath the high ceilings of Pierce County Superior Court. The room smelled faintly of varnished wood and paper dust, the kind of place where words mattered more than noise. Diane wore a blazer too crisp for someone who claimed poverty, her hair tied back tight, eyes sharp with defiance. Kellen sat behind her, restless, phone in hand like he couldn't survive without an audience. When the commissioner called the case, Diane launched into a story about family equity, about promises my father had made in spirit if not in writing. She spoke of informal rent, contributions she claimed I owed for the privilege of growing up in that house. But when pressed for proof, there was none. No lease, no receipts, no legal thread tying her story to the walls she clung to. Eamon placed the deed on the bench, then the 20-day notice, then the binder with photographs, receipts, and statements. My name repeated across the pages like a steady refrain. The commissioner's decision was brief. Almost surgical possession restored to me, writ of restitution to be issued, interference prohibited. Diane's mouth opened as if to argue, but the gavel came down, final and firm. Outside, the cold air carried Kellen's voice as he ranted into his phone camera, calling me heartless, a traitor to family. Strangers passing gave curious glances, but Eamon touched my elbow, guiding me down the steps without a word. The order was in hand, the date set, and for the first time in weeks, the ground beneath me felt solid as we walked toward the parking lot where everything would soon change again, the morning of the writ. I stood on the curb, binder tucked under my arm, waiting for the deputy to arrive. The street was quiet except for the drip of last night's rain from the eaves. Then a familiar sedan pulled into view, one I hadn't seen in too many years. My father stepped out, thinner than I remembered, but steadier, as though distance had stripped away the fog he once lived under. "Leora," he said, his voice low, carrying both apology and resolve. "I've filed for divorce. I should have done it sooner. I see her clearly now, and I see what I left you with." I searched his face, looking for hesitation, but he held my gaze. He explained what I already held in my hands, that the deed had been his way of guarding me while he was thousands of miles away. He had feared exactly this day might come, and the map he gave me had led me here. The sheriff's deputy arrived, crisp uniform and quiet authority cutting through the tension. Diane emerged with arms crossed, Kellen dragging behind her with boxes half-packed. Under the deputy's eye, they moved through the house, stripping it of what little claim they had left. At the doorway, Diane spun toward me, her voice sharp and desperate. "You owe us for family," before I could answer. My father stepped forward. His words were even, but they carried more weight than any raised voice. Family does not invoice belonging. By sunset, the house stood quiet again. Their voices had vanished, their clutter packed away, leaving only the hum of the furnace and the creak of floors that finally belonged to me without contest. I stepped across the threshold, ready for the silence that awaited. That evening, I walked barefoot across the hardwood, each step steady, each switch flipped on, not from fear, but from ceremony. The house glowed as if reminding me it had always been waiting, patient through the years of noise and intrusion. In the living room, I unwrapped the framed photo of my mother that had been boxed for too long and rehung it on the wall where Diane once hung bland, abstract prints. The sight of her smile settled the air in a way no candle ever could. The locks came next. I unscrewed the hardware with deliberate care, fitting new mechanisms into place. This time, the keys were mine alone, cut fresh at a shop on 6th Avenue, their edges sharp with promise. The scar left on the front door from the locksmith's drill would need fixing, so I scheduled a carpentry job, determined to mend what had been forced open. Over the next days, I worked through the details that matter more than most people realize. Over coffee along Ruston Way, I made lists, boundaries, maintenance, choices. I forwarded certified copies of the court order to the utilities, closed unauthorized accounts Diane had opened in my name, and sat down to draft a final letter through Eamon's office, a line drawn in ink to end any further contact. By the time I locked the front door with my own key, the house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a beginning, a place I could rebuild on my terms. The walls carried my history, but the silence belonged to me. And as I stood in the doorway, I knew the story I carried forward was finally my own.